Welcome back, everyone, to the eCoreAcademy e-learning platform. My name is AJay Raj, back with yet another eCore Express Java lesson for you all. And this lesson is going to be on exercises in our Unit 4 on loops. It's going to be the fourth exercise of the fourth unit, exercise 4.4. And in this fourth exercise of this unit, we're going to be covering the topic of conditional statements and loops, which is one of the concepts that we covered in our lessons portion of this unit. So we're going to be practicing that through our exercise in this lesson. So we're going to be practicing the concept of using conditional statements inside of loops with a critical thinking objective. The objective of this whole program is involving the user inputting a certain amount of numbers, and our program is going to be calculating how many of those numbers are divisible by 5, and it's going to also calculate the average of those numbers. So I'll show you what the exercise prompt is on our Eclipse workspace, and I'll run you through how to actually utilize our conditional statement within the loop, that specific variation of loops, and how it's going to be helping our critical thinking objective with this exercise. So let's make sure we master this concept today. So let's make sure that we switch over to our Eclipse workspace and do some real-time practice. All right, as you can see on my screen, I opened up my Eclipse workspace. I've just created a new class under our Unit 4, which is on loops. Under that main package, I created another class underneath that called Divisible5. This is going to be our official fourth exercise within this unit on loops, and this is obviously going to be tackling on that conditional statements inside of loops, that whole property, that whole exercise. So we're going to be taking a look at our exercise here. It's going to be called Divisible5, and essentially what we're going to be doing here, just to summarize this prompt, we're going to be writing a program that's going to input a series of integers. So that means the user can input a series of numbers that they would like, and they can input as many as they would want. So the first negative value that they enter will terminate the output, meaning that'll end the sequence of the code. So once they put in a negative number, the code will end and it'll print out whatever our results are. So what we're doing with those numbers that they're entering in is the program that we're going to make is going to determine and print the number of integers entered that are divisible by 6 and that are divisible by 5 and their average. So we're going to be calculating for all the numbers that are divisible by 5, and then we're going to display their overall average. Those are the numbers that are inputted by the user. However, if one of the integers entered are not divisible by 5, are not divisible by 5, we're going to display the message, none of the integers are divisible by 5. So if none of the integers that are entered by the user are divisible by 5, we're just going to display that output because we can't find an average if there aren't any numbers divisible by 5 that they entered. So when displaying the average, make sure to use the function decimal format. This decimal format function I will be showing you, it's going to be part of our Turtle graphics folder that we asked you to download at the beginning of the course. Kind of like our keyboard reader function, we're going to call it the same way. And what this function will do is it's going to help us round the number, our average, when we print it out to the console. It's going to help us round it to the nearest 2 decimal places, just in case we have a repeating decimal. We want to keep it concise. All right, so the very first step that we're going to do is we're going to be calling our 2 major functions here. The first function that we're going to call is keyboard reader, because remember, we're reading in inputs from the user, so the user is going to be entering them into the console. We have to read them into our program, so we're going to be using keyboard reader. And the second function is a new function, decimal format. We'll import it first, and then I'll show you how we're actually going to use it and how to actually write it in your code. So let's go to the very top of our program here. Let's clear some space right here. Let's hit enter, clear out our prompt. We're going to go up to the top of our code here. And we're going to go above our public class here. For any of our imports, whenever we're importing any functions from Turtle Graphics, we always put it above the public class and below the package name. So we're going to type in import. And then we're going to do our first function here. It's going to be Turtle Graphics keyboard reader. Just like that. Make sure you type it in exactly. That should be something that you memorized from our previous exercises. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to import another function. And this is going to be something very similar to like we imported from our Turtle Graphics. Decimal format is something that's also built into our Java program in Eclipse. So we can just download that directly. It's another folder that we also have built into Eclipse. So we're going to say java.text.decimal format, and then semicolon. So Turtle Graphics is something that we already inputted with our Turtle Graphics folder that we downloaded at the beginning. However, Java, just because we have Eclipse, it's a newer model. In terms of Java, we can just decimal format. The function is already built into our Eclipse, so we can just say java.text.decimal format, and that'll import our decimal format function, so we can use it in our program here. All right, so now that we've imported our two functions that we need for this program, here we actually have to declare them. So at the top, we're going to say keyboard reader equals new keyboard reader. I'm going to put parentheses and then a semicolon. So that way we just declared our keyboard reader function so that we can use it within our code. We declared it locally. Within this class, and then afterwards we're going to call our second function. Just get used to this syntax here. You're just going to have to copy this down, but this is the way that you declare the decimal format function. This is essentially what rounds it to whatever decimal point we want. So we're going to say decimal format df equals new decimal format, and then open parentheses, and then semicolon. So now that we have this decimal format, it's called decimal format df equals new decimal format. We're essentially creating this function here. It's called an object essentially, but we just declared this new function here. Just like we did here, keyboard reader equals new keyboard reader. We added that new in here. Similar format here, but all you need to know is that we're importing the function at the top, and then we're just declaring it up here so that we can use the function in our program somewhere. So like I said, decimal format is going to help us round off our final average value, the average of the numbers that are divisible by 5 that we want to print out to the console. It's going to help us round it to 2 decimal places. Now, in order to do that, it's a little bit tricky, but this is something specific to decimal format. If you see here the second decimal format here, right next to the parentheses, inside of the parentheses, you're going to be typing in 2 double quotes, and then you're going to be putting in how many decimal points you actually want. So you'd be putting in 0.00. So 0.00, this means that we're going to take any integer value, any just regular number that's not a decimal, any amount that can be as large as anything. And then after the decimal, we have 2 decimal points that go afterwards. So it'll round off to 2 decimal points. So we put 2 zeros as placeholders. All right, so now that we got more tricky part out of the way in terms of setting up our program, now we can start to think about what variables we're going to be using in our code, and then we can go ahead and create our loop and then our conditional statement within the loop. So that's the structure of this code. So the very first thing that we're going to do is we have to think of our variable declarations. I'll just put that here. Variable declarations. Just say here function declarations. All right, so now we declared our functions. Let's go on and declare our variables. Now, if you think about our code here, we're trying to find the total amount of numbers that are going to be divisible by 5. So we need a few variables in this case. And like we said, they're going to be, some of them are going to be integers, some of them are going to be doubles, because remember when we're calculating an average, that could possibly be a decimal. So we need to have some doubles and some integers. So let's create our integers first. The first integer that I'm going to be creating is called number. So number is essentially going to be whatever number of numerical value that the user enters into the console. We're going to store that in the variable called number, and that's for all the numbers. We're going to keep restoring it into that variable called number. Now, the second variable that we're going to be creating is called remainder, and I'll explain what we're going to use remainder for. After that, we're going to be calling a variable called counter. And the counter is going to be used for a while loop. Remember, we're going to be creating a loop for this program. I chose to create a while loop just to switch it up because I created a lot of for loops in the past. You can interchange it with the for loop, but for now we're going to go with the while loop. And whenever you're creating a loop, you need to create a counter variable. So up here, we're going to be creating our counter, and we always assign it a value whenever we declare it. So we're going to set our counter equal to 0. And then afterwards, we're going to create something called total. A variable called total. That's going to be the sum of all the numbers that are divisible by 5 before we actually divide them and find their average. We're going to also assign this value equal to 0, and I'll explain why. And then, so that's all for our integers here. And then we're going to be creating one double. Now remember, the doubles can essentially store a decimal value in, and because we're going to be calculating an average, the average is not always an integer. So we're going to be creating a variable called average. That's what we're going to actually be displaying out We're going to calculate the average of all the numbers divisible by 5 that the user enters. We're going to display that out, so we're going to create a double called average. All right, so now that we've created all of our variables here, we're going to be using all of them throughout our code, and I'm going to explain as I go why we created these variables, so that we can just slot them into our code. So the first thing that we're going to do is, like I said before, we're going to be creating our regular system.out.println statement before we create our while loop. Now remember how I said we always need to create something that we're going to read in the variable from. So we're going to be asking the user every time, we're going to be asking them to enter a number. That's going to be a positive number, or it could be a negative to terminate the output. So we need to create a system.out.println statement that's going to ask them to enter a number. So we're going to say, please enter a number negative to terminate. Let me just remove my webcam here a little bit. So as you can see here, I'm saying please enter a number, and if it's a negative number, it's going to terminate. Let's just say please enter an integer, just to be more specific. Please enter an integer, and then if it's negative, we're going to terminate the code, meaning it's going to stop. And I'll show you what that's going to look like as well. But just for now, we're just going to write that system.out.println statement. And now that we've written that out, we need to make sure that we're asking the user to actually input a certain number every time that they're repeating the code. It's going to be a loop, so it's going to be repeating. It's going to repeatedly ask them. So we need to store whatever number they enter into a variable. So that's why we created this variable called number. It's an integer. We're going to say number equals reader dot read int, and end that with a semicolon. All that's going to do is it's going to read in the value that the user enters in. So it's going to store that in our variable called number. All right. Case here. So next thing that we're going to do is we're going to be starting our while loop. So this is essentially going to be asking the individual to enter whatever value they would like. And then afterwards, we're going to be creating our while loop here. So this is just for the first time that the program runs. So let's go ahead and create our while loop. So we'll say while. Okay, and then let's create our braces here. All right, so as you can see, we just created our while loop here. And what's going to be our qualification for our while loop? What's going to allow the code to keep running within the while loop until something happens? So remember how we said we're going to ask the user to repeatedly enter a number. The only way that the program will stop asking them to enter a number and it'll print out the average is if they enter a negative number. So if they enter a negative number, then we want the program to stop, and we want to display the average of all the numbers that are divisible by 5. In order to do that, we have to make sure that we have something that's going to pass through, a conditional for our while loop. So we're going to say that number that they enter, every time they enter a number, it's going to check if that number is greater than 0. So if the number is greater than 0, then we're going to go inside of our while loop, and then we're going to calculate, if it's divisible by 5, and then how it contributes to the average. But if it's less than 0, it won't go through the while loop, and it'll just say we're ending the code here. So if it is greater, it'll go through the while loop. If it's not greater, however, it'll exit this while loop, and we'll go out here outside of the while loop, and we'll just create a regular system.out.println statement, and then that'll just say it's not greater than your code is terminated, basically. But for now, let's focus on the inside of the while loop here. So like I said before, this code is essentially all about creating a conditional inside of a while loop. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we have to create some sort of concept. How are we going to calculate if the number that the individual entered is going to be divisible by 5? Well, the only way to do that is calculate a remainder. We're going to divide that number by 5, and if that number is divisible by 5, it won't have any remainder. Its remainder will be equivalent to 0. So we're going to create, that's why we created this variable called remainder up here, right here. So we're going to be using that value, that variable right here. So within the while loop here, we're going to set our remainder value equal to 0. That's because every time this while loop runs, every time the user enters a new number, this while loop will run again, and it'll refresh the remainder, the variable remainder, so that we can redo that calculation every time to see if it's divisible by 5. So we'll set the remainder equal to 0, and all we're going to do is we're going to say remainder is equal to our number here. The number is going to be the number that the individual inputted. Each time it's going to be refreshed when they run the code. So we're going to say remainder equals number modulus 5. If we remember our modulus function, Modulus essentially calculates the remainder after dividing by a certain number. So essentially here it's going to say number divided by 5, whatever number they have divided by 5. And then what's going to be stored in remainder is the remainder of this calculation. So if, say, for example, the number is 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1. That means the remainder is going to be equivalent to 1, the modulus function here, the modulus operation here. All right, so now that we've calculated a remainder of the number that they entered in, we're going to say, to see whether or not it's divisible by 5. So we're going to say if the remainder is equal to 0. This double equal sign just says it's essentially comparing the value. So it's saying if the value of remainder is equal to 0, then we would say here counter plus plus. Now, the reason why we're saying counter plus plus is we calculated that if the remainder is equal to 0, that means the number is divisible by 5. So we created that variable up here. That's why we created this variable up here called counter. We set it equal to 0 initially because we're going to be immediately adding values to it. We're going to say the counter is equal to 0 at the very top. And then within the function here, what's going to happen is within the if statement here, we're going to increase that counter by 1. That counter is going to be counting how many total numbers that the individual inputted are actually divisible by 5. And then afterwards, we're going to say the total equals total plus number. So what this statement here, right here is doing is we created our variable up here called total. We set that equal to 0 because we're going to be immediately changing its value. We're going to be immediately updating its value. So if that remainder is equal to 0, if the number that the user inputted is divisible by 5, that means we're going to increase the counter by 1. That means it's going to increase how many total numbers are divisible by 5. That's what the counter is going to count. And then afterwards here, it's going to say we're going to add on that number to our total. So that total is just going to be a running total of the total, the sum of all the numbers divisible by 5. Because remember, you need to find the sum of all values before you calculate their average. So we're going to divide that total by the counter at the end to discover the total average of all the numbers that are divisible by 5. All right. So now that we've created an if statement, that's going to only determine if the number that the user entered is divisible by 5. However, what's going to happen if it isn't? So we created an if statement here. If the remainder is equal to 0. So if the remainder is not equal to 0, it's not divisible by 5. So it won't even go inside of this if statement. So it'll exit this if statement and it'll immediately go on to the code afterwards. After this if statement, it'll skip the if statement. So down here, we can just create a system.out.println statement here. It's going to be saying, that's going to essentially repeat that line of code that we had before. We're going to say, please enter your number. Please enter a number. Negative to terminate. So you can ask them to enter that number here. And then we're just going to say number equals reader.readInt. So all we did here was once a user enters their number, we calculate if it's divisible by 5, we calculate the remainder. If the remainder is equal to 0, then we're going to add it to our counter and we're going to add it to our running total because we're going to use that in our later calculation. However, if it's not divisible by 5, it'll skip the if statement and we won't add it to our counter. We won't add it as a valid number that's divisible by 5. We'll just skip over that number and then we'll just go back again, asking them to re-input another value. Either way, if it's divisible or not divisible, it's going to go through this code and it's going to ask them to re-input a value. If it's not divisible, we won't count it. That's simply how this while loop works. So after this, we're going to close off our while loop here at the very end. So yes, we're going to close off our while loop right here. And that's going to be the end of our while loop. So what's going to happen is this is going to essentially keep repeating through. It's going to discover whether or not the number that the individual entered is divisible by 5 here. It's going to add it to the counter if it is, and add it to our running total. Add the actual number value to the running total. If it isn't, it's just not going to do anything. It's not going to count it. And it's just going to keep on asking them to keep on re-entering a number. But once they hit the negative number, it's going to terminate, meaning once they hit the negative number, it's going to go back to the top of the while loop and it's going to exit this while loop. So once they hit exit, we want to be able to print out their results. So we're going to print out their essentially if they have any numbers that are divisible by 5, we want to print out the total average of those numbers. Or if there aren't any numbers that they inputted that are divisible by 5, we want to say that the user did not enter any numbers that were divisible by 5. All right, so now down here outside of our while loop is a little bit simpler here. We're just going to say we're going to create another if statement outside of here, and that's going to say if the counter is greater than 0, and remember the counter is how many total numbers were divisible by 5. So if the counter is greater than 0, meaning if any of the numbers that they entered was actually divisible by 5 here, that counter is counting how many numbers were divisible by 5. If that's greater than 0, then we're going to be printing out the average of those numbers, the average of the numbers that they had that were divisible by 5. So we're going to be saying average. We created that variable at the very top of our program called average, and it's a double, so it can store a decimal value in case. So we're going to be putting in here, this is a very unique syntax here, but we're going to essentially be doing a calculation. We want to divide that total amount, the total sum of all the numbers that were divisible by 5 that we created up here in this line of code right here. We essentially want to divide that by the counter, which is the amount of numbers that were divisible by 5, and that's going to find us our average. Taking the sum and dividing by the total number of numbers in that data set. So we're going to be going here. We're going to type in our number total here, and we're going to essentially divide it by the counter, and that's going to find the average of all the numbers that were divisible by 5. But before we do that, we have to put in parentheses something called double. We just have to declare that this total here, this number here, total divided by counter, it's okay that we're storing a decimal here. Remember, total and counter that we created at the very top, those two variables were integers, but since we're dividing them, there is a possibility that there could be a decimal. Not everything works out smoothly. You could have 5 divided by 3 in this case, and that's not necessarily going to be an integer. So because it's an integer divided by integer, it's going to be equivalent to a double. You just have to do something called typecasting. You just put double in front of that calculation, and the program will essentially say it's okay to have a result that has a decimal, even though you're dividing two integers. So then essentially it'll be taking that decimal value of total divided by counter, and it'll store it in our variable called average, and that's a double, so it can store decimals. All right, and now that we've done that calculation, we can simply print out this average. That's the main goal of a program. We're going to print out that average to the console. We'll say there are, and then over here we'll just put we'll print out our variable here, concatenation here. So we'll say counter numbers divisible by 6, and the average is, let me just enter this. Scroll over, see. And the average is, and then we'll print out the average here, and I'll show you what that looks like as well. So over here, what we're essentially doing is we're saying there are blank numbers divisible by 6. This counter here was essentially counting how many numbers were divisible by 6 from our initial program here. I'm sorry, should be divisible by 5 here. How many numbers in our program were actually divisible by 5 that we initially calculated up here. And then that's just going to print out there are these many numbers that are divisible by 5. And then the average, we're going to be printing out the average. Now, the way that we print out the average and round it to the nearest 2 decimal places, we have to use that special decimal format function. So we're going to say here, we're going to put our parentheses here, double quotes here. We're going to be putting our double quotes here. Let me scroll over. And the average is, and then we're going to put our double quote here. We're going to say df, we're going to say plus sign, df.format, and then we're going to put average. So all this is saying here is we're going to put the plus sign. Remember, we always put a plus sign whenever we're not printing out text and we're printing out an actual variable value. So like here we printed out counter as an actual variable value that we're printing out. So we don't need to put it in double quotes. It's outside of the double quotes. So same here, we're going to put this outside of the quotes. We're going to say plus, you always add a plus sign. You're going to say plus df.format, and then df.format is essentially implementing that decimal format, or we're rounding it to 2 decimal points. We declare that at the very top when we declared the actual function. and that's the decimal format for short. And then we're going to put our variable name within the parentheses. So it's going to round this value average to 2 decimal points, and it's going to print that out to our console window. So essentially, we finished out the first part of this final conditional statement. That's going to display whether or not, if there are any values that the user entered that are divisible by 5, it's going to print out their average and how many actual numbers they entered were divisible by 5. But remember, if they didn't enter any numbers that were divisible by 5, this counter value here is not going to be greater than 0. It's going to be equal to 0. So it means there's no running total, no numbers that were actually divisible by 5. So then we have to create an else statement saying if there weren't any values divisible by 5, we have to simply print out that statement, system.out.println. We're just going to say there are no numbers divisible by 5. So that's when our counter is equal to 0. That means that none of the values that they entered were divisible by 5. It's just going to simply put a println statement saying that there are no numbers divisible by 5. All right, so now that we finished that up, we finished our program here. Just to summarize, up here we created our variables here that we were going to use. And then up here we created our first system.out.println statement. That's before we actually enter our loop. That's going to ask them for the first time. It's going to ask them to input a number. And then we're going to read that number in. And then we're going to enter our while loop here. This while loop up here is only going to run if the number is greater than 0. And if it's divisible by 5, it's going to add this to our counter. It's going to add the value of the number to our running total, and it's going to count how many total numbers are divisible by 5. However, if it isn't, it's going to obviously just not going to add to our counter or our running total. After we finish this if statement here, it checks this if statement. Then we just keep on asking them to enter a new number, a new number, a new number over and over again. It's going to keep going through this while loop until they enter a negative number. Once they enter that negative number, it's going to jump out of this while loop and it's going to go to this if statement, this if else statement right here. So saying if the counter is greater than 0, so if there were any numbers entered that were that were divisible by 5, this counter is going to be greater than 0. We're going to calculate their average, and then we're going to print out how many numbers were divisible by 5 that they actually entered in, and their total average right here, over here, and then we're going to enter in their average. We also use the decimal format to round this to 2 decimal places. And then finally, if there weren't any numbers that were divisible by 5, we created an else statement that's going to simply print out to the console, there are no numbers divisible by 5. So none of the values they entered were divisible by 5 if we go to the else statement. All right, so now that we've finished that giant piece of code, let's actually go ahead and test it out. Let's hit save, and let's hit play. All right, so the code is going to asking us, please enter an integer, and if you enter a -1, it'll terminate the code. So let's enter an integer called, let's enter 5, the number 5. So entered 5 right here. We're going to hit enter. It's going to keep asking us to enter more numbers, so let's add another number, 10. Okay, let's add another number, 25. All right, so we added in 3 numbers, 5, 10, and 25. So now that we've added 5, 10, and 25 together, we can just calculate in our head. We know that 5, 10, and 25 are all divisible by 5. So the code should print out that there are 3 numbers divisible by 5. And it should also print out their total average. So if we add 5, 10, and 25, it should be 5 plus 10 is 15. And then 15 plus 25 is 40. So when we divide 40 by 3, that should be approximately just about 13 point something. So it should be 13 point something and should be rounded to 2 decimal places. It's not going to be exact. It's going to be a repeating decimal. But because of the decimal format, it should be about around that 13.33 range, around there. So it should be a decimal rounded to the 2 nearest decimal places. So we're going to add a negative number here. We're going to type in a negative number to terminate the code so that we can see our results. So once we type in -1, it'll type in our results here. It's going to say that there are 3 numbers, which is correct. 5, 10, and 25 are all divisible by 5, the number 5. And the average is correct, like we said, 13.33, because 40 divided by 40 is the sum of all the numbers, 5, 10, and 25. That's going to be 40. We're going to divide it by 3. There's 3 total numbers. Should be approximately 13.33. That decimal format, it rounded it off to the nearest 2 decimal places instead of going 13.333 repeating. So that also works. So technically, in a technical standpoint, our code is fully functional. All right, everyone. So that'll be it for today's lesson. I hope you all enjoyed. Please make sure to like and subscribe down below if you like the video, and feel free to leave a comment down below if you have any questions or any concerns about the lesson. Make sure to check out our website at www.ecoreacademy.org and check out all of our socials in the description box down below. It's really greatly appreciated. This has been AJ Raj, and I will see you all in the next lesson. Thanks for joining us.